By now, you've probably seen Rabbit's bright orange, AI-powered companion, the R1, all over the internet. It's been making waves for its retro-inspired design, reasonably approachable price tag, and its pretty quick answers to some of your more straightforward research questions. It's being pitched as a speedy companion to your smartphone rather than a small device that's designed to replace it. However, the R1 has made just as many headlines for its relatively limited set of launch day features, and the fact that even when it does answer your questions, it's not always getting them right. And it leaves a lot of people asking, why isn't this just an app instead? Well, the answer to that one's a little bit trickier and a little bit more involved. I'm gonna head out for a pretty usual day with the R1 as my primary device, and we'll see just how well it does. I'll start my morning by pulling the R1 off its charger, so it will start at 100%, but if it runs out partway through the day, that's where we end. I will note that I'm doing this after Rabbit's first comprehensive update, which claimed to make the battery life 5 times better, so it should be able to make it through the day. As promised, the first thing I do is pull my Rabbit R1 off the charger. Like most gadgets, it charges via USB-C, and the R1 comes with a 1000 milliamp hour battery inside of its plastic shell. Unfortunately, the small size means there's no option for wireless charging, and you actually don't get any way to charge it when you unbox the R1. There's no charger in the box, there's not even a USB-C cable, so you're gonna end up having to use whatever you have from your existing smartphone. After pulling the R1 off its charger, this is usually where I'd head down to my apartment gym for a quick workout before I get my day started. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot I can do with the R1 at this point. Sure, I could pair a set of Bluetooth headphones and stream Spotify while I work out, but I already use my smartphone to manage workouts through Nike Training Club, which isn't one of the R1's supported apps. So unfortunately, the R1's gonna have to wait about an hour. As it turns out, waiting that hour is not a bad thing because it gives us a quick look at the R1's passive battery drain. It was sitting here on my counter for the full stretch, and it only dropped about 3%, which is a massive improvement following the update. Also, now that I'm back from the gym, I have the chance to put the R1 through its first actual test of the day, which is streaming Spotify out loud while I hop in the shower. The good news is, in my experience, the R1 is actually pretty good at picking up on Spotify commands and jumping into the music. And by that, I mean when I ask it to play music, it starts pretty quickly. Play the Killers album Sam's Town on Spotify. Unfortunately, it's not very easy to control your playback on the device, and you don't really have a good way to manage your queue of songs or anything else. For example, I asked it to play the album Sam's Town by The Killers, and it jumped right into the title track, Sam's Town. But following that, it pretty much just shuffled from a list of similar artists. So instead of continuing with the album, I got artists like Weezer and The Strokes instead. Also, there's no way to skip forward in a song or jump to a different song with the R1 if you're trying to use it hands-free, because you have to use the gray multifunction button. With the R1, I'm pretty much stuck listening to whatever it picks out until I can get my hands back on it. The R1 also doesn't seem to understand if I ask it to play my Spotify day list, which changes every couple hours. Sometimes it'll give me just a recommended playlist of songs, and other times it'll ask me to request something else entirely. With my morning routine out of the way, it's about time to head to a coffee shop and do some work. But before I do that, I'll ask it a quick sports question that I already happen to know the answer to, which is how the Baltimore Orioles did in their game last night. Did the Orioles win last night?
Let me see what I can find. The Baltimore Orioles lost the game against the New York Yankees with a score of 2-0 on May 1st, 2024.
This time, shockingly, the R1 got everything right. The O's did in fact fall to the Yankees at home by a score of 2-0. I've asked the R1 the same question a couple days in a row now, and it usually only manages to get 3 of the 4 key pieces of data right. It's usually good about the opponent and the result, but a lot of the time it'll get the score completely wrong, whether it's giving me a score from a previous game against the same opponent, or just not able to pull up a score at all. Baseball check-in aside, it's time to find a coffee shop. And I'll be honest, I've asked the R1 which coffee shop is closest to me several days in a row now, and I've gotten different answers every time, including answers that seem to be getting further and further away every time I talk to it. What coffee shop is closest to me, and how do I get there?
Searching now. The closest coffee shop to Baltimore, Maryland, 21224. United States is Hannah's Cafe in Towson, Maryland, approximately 50
Now, that's not even a little bit correct, so I'm gonna go to a coffee shop that I know. I'm in the heart of Baltimore, and it's giving me answers in Towson, which is a half an hour drive away. And not only that, that half an hour drive involves passing several other coffee shops that are either right down the street or even a mile or two away. But once I get to the coffee shop, I'll pair my R1 with a pair of Bluetooth headphones and get back to streaming a little bit more Spotify while I work. I thought the R1 struggles to play the music I wanted would be the worst part of the Spotify experience, but I was wrong. It's actually that the Bluetooth connection is downright terrible, stuttering through every song on my playlist and trying to speed up to catch up to where the song should be every time I want to listen to something. And worse, the R1 only supports mono playback, so I'm getting the same sounds through both sides of my Pixel Buds Pro. Now that it's noon, it's time to put the R1 through another one of its more intensive tests, ordering lunch. Rabbit hung its hat on the DoorDash experience during its launch event, and I wanted to see if I could recreate the experience. I wanted something a little more local than the McDonald's that CEO Jesse Liu ordered for one of his friends while we were at the event. So I pulled out the R1 and I asked it to order from Indo Viet, a local Vietnamese place. Open DoorDash and order from Indo Viet in Baltimore.
Okie dokie. I'll help you order some food. DoorDash may take a while to load on RabbitOS and may not be available in all regions.
Color me equal parts surprised and impressed that that actually worked. I've had friends and fellow reviewers try in vain to get something through DoorDash, with it never actually getting all the way through to checkout. With that in mind, I never really expected the R1 to get through from start to finish in one single try, but here we are. And after several failed requests and near misses earlier in the day, I'd call that a pretty good turnaround for the R1. Of course, I already had a pretty specific idea of what I wanted, which made the DoorDash experience a lot easier. If you're not quite sure what you want and you just want a list of restaurants nearby, or you want to choose from a much longer menu, the R1 is probably not your best bet. If you just ask it to order food, it's only going to pull up a list of 3 or maybe 4 restaurants nearby, and when you choose one, you're only getting about 5 pre-selected items from the menu. Another one of the R1's day one features is its ability to record and summarize conversations in real time. So with an Apple event on the horizon, let's pull up a video and do a little bit of research and make notes for later once I have to figure out what to expect from these new iPads. Now, the tricky part of this setup is there's no way to go back and replay your recordings on the R1 itself, nor is there a way to actually look at the notes that the device summarized for you. Sure, it's a good way to save yourself a little bit of time and not try to look at your notes right away if you're in a briefing, but it also means that you have to have a desktop computer in order to access all of this. The rabbit hole doesn't currently work on mobile devices, so there's no way to go from a recording in one hand to AI-generated notes in the other. Now that I'm wrapping up work for the day, let's see how the R1's vision mode fares. It's pretty easy to activate with a double tap of the gray multifunction button, and then you simply point the camera at whatever you're trying to identify, and then you hold the multifunction button and ask it questions. I decided I would take a walk over to a local record shop to check out a couple different used vinyl options. Knowing that I only have 2 hands, one for the camera and one for the R1, I was hoping I would be able to ask it questions about records without using my hands. My idea with this is that I would be able to find out the track listings for each different record before I actually picked it up, flipped it over, and decided whether I wanted to buy it or not. Asking the R1 a bunch of questions about a record in a noisy record store is probably not the best way to get the results across on video. So I redid some of these tests in my apartment with a record that I already have, because it's going to give you similar results, but you're not going to have as much background noise. What songs are on this album?
Let me see. I do not see an album or track list in this image. The image appears to show the cover art of an album titled Hotel California by the band The Eagles, which features a cityscape with palm trees silhouetted against a sunset sky. Without additional information about the contents of the album, I cannot determine what specific
So you can figure out it's Hotel California, but you can't tell me what's on it. Strangely enough, if you just ask the R1 what songs are on Hotel California, it can pull them up and give you an answer. So I'm not entirely sure where the disconnect is with being able to identify the cover art and then pull up track listings versus just asking for track listings. At this point, I'm not really sure what vision mode is supposed to do, but I want to give it another chance. So far, it hasn't told me anything that I can't pick out with my own two eyes, but we'll see if it can almost recreate one of the CEO's tests. I asked it what it could tell me about a singular pink running shoe just to see what it would come back with. What can you tell me about this running shoe? There's one shoe, and it is pink, not blue. My day of testing was a pretty warm one, so a couple friends and I were planning to go for ice cream after we finished our run, and I just wanted to make sure that the shop would actually be open. Unfortunately, at this point, I couldn't get the R1 to connect to my phone's hotspot no matter what I did, which meant that there was no actual way to ask it questions or expect to get answers. But hey, I finished a pretty full day of use with right around 35% battery remaining, which is a pretty impressive mark compared to where it was before the major software update. As you might imagine, I didn't quite have time or have a need to test out all of the R1's features during my day of testing. I didn't call a ride with Uber, I didn't generate images with Midjourney, and I didn't use the two-way translation feature that can also be summarized in notes in the rabbit hole. Oh, and there's a ton of things that you expect your phone to be able to do that you might expect the R1 to also be able to do, like set alarms, set timers, send text messages, video calling, and checking live sports scores, none of which it can currently do. Maybe they'll come eventually. It does feel like Rabbit is on top of sending out software updates, but it's kind of a matter of how quickly they actually show up. So it's been a day, and I have some thoughts about how everything the R1 did got right, got wrong, and it's time to kind of clear them up. First, Rabbit's initial OTA update made a lot of things a lot better with the R1, starting with battery life. Before the update, the battery would drop like a lead balloon, basically draining from the time I unplugged it in the morning and being dead by lunchtime. The scroll wheel is also a lot more responsive, actually feeling like it rolls just as far as you push it, instead of having to roll extra far to get just a couple options down the menu. That said, the R1's controls for volume and brightness are terrible. For a device that you're supposed to be able to use alongside your phone, and ideally with one hand, you wind up using two hands to change either the brightness or the volume, and you have to change the volume for 3 different settings at once. Where on your phone, you can just pull down a quick menu and change the volume or brightness either using the rockers or a slider. With the R1, you open the settings menu, then you have to hold down the multifunction button, and with your other hand, use the scroll wheel up or down to change the volume. It's way more complicated than it needs to be, and is probably an example of where phones get things much easier and much more straightforward. As for my thoughts on using the R1 itself, they're a little more mixed, which is not a great sign for something that wants to replace your phone. Sometimes the R1 actually sticks the landing, getting the results right or ordering lunch without that much of an issue. But other times it just crashes and burns and gets something totally wrong, or just doesn't know how to respond. And when it did offer some form of information, like telling me that the cover of Hotel California was the cover of Hotel California, it wasn't able to answer the other part of my question, which was asking what songs are on the album. So I find that it's just one of those features that you're probably not going to end up using because it's not actually making life any easier or getting you answers any quicker. Now, I will put a little bit of faith into the Rabbit team rolling out the first OTA update pretty quickly. I do think that means that they're on top of trying to make the experience better, but I'm just not sure that putting small band-aids on a device that launched probably before it was ready was the right move when it feels like the R1 really needs a cast. But I'll be honest, I think probably the worst thing to come out of my long day with the R1 is the fact that I'm still not sure what I would actually use it for. Nor do I know what I would recommend friends or interested customers in buying it for. And even though the R1 successfully played some form of music from Spotify and actually successfully ordered me lunch through DoorDash, it felt like I was gambling every time I asked it for something. Oh, and when someone asked why the R1 interface isn't just an app, I found myself explaining that, well, it kind of is. Rabbit's large action model isn't running on your phone, it's running in the cloud. But the device itself uses a low-powered MediaTek processor that basically just has to be able to communicate with the cloud. So as soon as you figure out the APK and install it on another device, you're able to access the same set of questions, the same set of features, and you don't have to use a scroll wheel. You can use the touchscreen and the navigation that you're already used to on your phone. Sure, you'll have to give up carrying around Rabbit's cute little hardware with the teenage engineering design and the bright orange color, but it does free up some space in your pocket, and you no longer have to question whether you're using the right device for whatever you're trying to do. So at the end of a long, largely disappointing day, that's the Rabbit R1. It's a cute piece of hardware that has lofty dreams, but the current experience just doesn't live up to any part of them. It leaves so much to be desired, most of which you can already do on a device that's probably already in your pocket, and you already know how to navigate from start to finish, and that being your smartphone. It's probably what you're going to use most of the time anyway. I had to use it to set up the data for my R1, meaning that I couldn't use one without the other. So if you're really not sure if you want to spend the money on the R1, there's probably a reason for that. And it's because right now, as it exists, it's not adding a whole heck of a lot to your daily setup. It doesn't offer more useful apps. It doesn't quite break you free of apps, and it doesn't do most of the things that you would expect it to do if you wanted to replace your phone. If you still feel compelled to buy the R1 for yourself, you can do so down below, but maybe save yourself the $200 for right now.